Now let's understand command concept using a diagram. So what is it that happens here is, let's say the example that we saw. So let's say there are a couple of controls that we have. There is one control called as button that we saw. So I'm going to name here, this was a button control. Now obviously on a button click, what to do, we can always mention in couple of ways. One way is using code behind file. So we can always have in code behind some code written. So code behind, and we can always have some sort of code written, like maybe button underscore click kind of function written and some code. Maybe I'll mention here some C# code here. And by default, what we can always do is we can always convey, that is, we are in need of clubbing these two together. So we can always convey by linking these two together like this. So in XAML we can mention that on click we need to go and write down or go and execute some piece of code. So somewhere in the XAML itself one can very well convey, that is, click is equal to, and then we can simply mention here in double quote some function like button underscore click and so and so. So maybe I'll just mention here some click like functionality, So click here. So you can read it as button underscore click, as I have given name here, button underscore click. So this is very routine that all of us deal with. Now the next thing that you saw, on a button click there was a code which was actually copying something from the text boxes. So what that code means? So you will find out that code was not in the code behind. So you will see where was that code written. So it's not like there was no code, there was code. So let's say the code which was for actually copying something or actual logic, I would say. So I'll mention here actual logic. For what? Maybe for simple copy, maybe for simple paste, maybe for simple, let's say, database operations. Let's say database operations, or simply any logic that we would like to execute. This particular logic which is written, this logic always can be part of something which is called as, what we can call it as, some functionality or some function written somewhere. So we can always have some function written somewhere which can always have the logic written. Okay. Normally in case of object-oriented programming language, normally the logic that we write down, that logic always exists in some class. Let us call this particular logic exists in some sort of utility class, or this logic exists in some sort of data source class, let's say. So it can be some utility or some logic class that we can have. Maybe I'll just put down and cut down some spaces over here so that we all can see it. So in general, one person can very well go and write down maybe content like this. So in a similar manner, there was some time back some class which was written by Microsoft, and that particular class had a logic for copy paste. Similar way, we can also end up writing some code for database operations, for any logic that we want to execute on a button click. But then how was the linking done some time back? The linking was done in a bit weird way. The linking was, it was conveyed to the button, that is, you need to execute some command. And we simply mention here, we need to execute copy, or we need to execute something called as paste, or I can mention here, let's say, some DB update like operation you should execute. And then by default, if you have seen, we mention these values through application commands concept. So we mention these values to one property, and that property in case of button was something called as command property, if you recall. So there was this property called as command, and then we try to bind this command property with cut, copy, paste, or certain things that we will write down soon, which is called as database update, insert, or delete. So what exactly command means over here? Just like every property is of some type. For example, here in case of button, you will find out there is a property which is called as height, for example, which is ultimately can accept the value and can give the value which is typically of double type. Similar way, content is a property which can actually hold either some sort of other content control, or it can simply hold some text which is seen on top of a button, like click me, like update me, and something like that. So by default, every property will be of some type, and then only respective value can be set up to it. Similar way, if command is one property of a button, what is the type of it? So you will see command is ultimately a property which can always expect something which is any class object which is ultimately of type iCommand. Ultimately, some class that it needs which implements iCommand. So some command that implements, maybe X command I will say here, that should implement iCommand. Maybe I should say in this case it was copy. So ultimately copy was something which should have implemented iCommand. Now here is a case. Ultimately there was a class. It's not a method which is implementing the interface. It is a class which implements the interface. So I should say over here some class. Maybe I should say some CLS over here which implements iCommand over here. And then there's a linking between these two which happens here. So in a button there was a command property which was of type iCommand, and ultimately it expected a class to be bound with it which is of type iCommand. But then when I said it expects a class which implements iCommand, you must have seen this before as well. That is, it's not something that we bind a class with. You will always notice that binding that we have always seen through property engine of WPF, you must have noticed this all the time we did some binding. That binding was always and always between property to property. It was always property from one property to other property, like getter setters or dependency properties max. So you will find out here the command must have been over here a property of iCommand type, and over here also what is expected is there is expected a property of type some class. So just like there is a name property of string type, there should be a property of type some class. So where exactly we will end up writing this some class property? So normally what we can have is we can always have somebody acting as a data source. So simplest example will be just like some sessions back we saw here. Let's say there can be a class written called as, let's say, EMP, and that EMP class can always have number, that can always have name acting as a data source properties specifically for the entire window like this. So this class very well can go and act as a data source, let's say. So if this class can act as a data source, let's mention here data source here. So if EMP class is acting as a data source for the entire window, let's say, and then number and name can be bound with some text boxes text, it can be bound with some text labels content, and so on. Just like that, right now we are expecting a property of type some class. So what can be done over here is we can very well end up writing some property, let's call it as my command property, which is ultimately of type iCommand. And then since right now instead of iCommand, some class ultimately implements this so-called iCommand, you will find out my command will be a getter setter of ultimately of type some class. And this particular my command is something that is what we can always and always bind with something called as command. So what we need to understand is there is some class which needs to implement iCommand, and that class type property is something that we need to bind with something called as command of a button. Okay, what will happen then? But what exactly command will have? That is something we haven't seen. So you will find out what goes in this so-called some class. So you will find out whenever we implement iCommand in the some class, so you will find out in this class called as sum class, which implements I command, we will get few things by default. We will get one thing which is called as on execution, and then we will get something which is called as can execute, which means this particular class that we have will be responsible for implementing couple of methods, couple of what we call it as implementations. These implementations are going to go and decide here, that is something like which code to execute, and then is it or is the condition for execution of the code met or correct. So here we will just check if the condition for execution of a code has met, then only what we will do is we will ultimately go for execution of a code. So what exactly is like which code to execute? As we discussed some time back, here this thing which is called as which code to execute is ultimately some functionality that we talked about. So we are trying to tell the button that is on click, WPF we will convey, runtime will convey that whenever button gets clicked, please execute something which is implementation or something which is conveyed by some class. We will convey to button, on a button click, execute something which is conveyed by some class. And then what some class conveys? Some class conveys, that is what code to execute is conveyed in here, and then that way we will get to know which function to execute. And then whether to execute that code or not is also something through code we can convey. So ultimately there is an implementation of I command which is going to be responsible for checking the condition whether we can execute the code, and then telling here that is this is the code that we are supposed to execute. Does that mean some class does not have that code implementation of DB operations copy paste like functionality? Absolutely no. If you have heard of, there is a concept that we have which is called as single responsibility principle. So single responsibility principle we can call, and then which is very well known in solid principles as a first principle called as SRP in here. And then every system design is always made up, at least OOP based system design is always made up on basis of solid principles, 5 typical principles that we have. So barring the object oriented application or object oriented programming pillars, there are 5 principles that every architect follows while designing the system. So one of the very basic principle that we have, which is called a single responsibility principle. Every class or entity that you design must have a logically single responsibility. Single responsibility doesn't mean single function. It means logical grouping of the functionality is what we should have. So what happens now is by default, if these functions are going to, let's say if we would have added these functions in the command class, then command class itself is responsible for doing the binding. Command class would have been responsible for execution of actual code, and command class is responsible for checking whether to execute a code or not. And that's the reason what you see now is there is a separation of concerns, separation of so-called you can say logic that we have done. So your actual code logic is part of some other class. Then a simple class which is acting as a mediator, which will keep on telling button, ultimately WPF runtime, whether we can execute the code in the other class, and then if yes, then let's go and maybe give a call to it. Now the other concern that you may have is how we will give a call to this function. Normally there is always a call to from A class to B class without we having any kind of a hierarchy or any kind of a relationship between these two classes. We can always manage a calling of A class function into B class or B class function into A class using a concept called as delegate. Now in case of C# or in case of .NET, either you can design a delegate by yourself, or what you can do is you can use inbuilt delegate. So action delegate and func delegate, these are two different generic delegates that we have, which has got a variety of different parameters as in generic parameters, and we can use those delegates in order to call actual logic. So you will notice button click need not be handled in this manner, like the way we have written earlier. In this manner, I mean to say. So you may just keep this writing the code behind the scene. We can just keep XAML only, and then actual button click logic can be written somewhere here. And then we can couple this logic with respect to the button using this concept called as I command. So one can very well skip, so-called you can say maybe writing logic like this over here, and then one can very well keep on writing logic not in the code behind, but then in a separate class that we have. So you will find out for maintenance perspective, commands play a very vital role. So in WPF, we have this MVVM design pattern, which will make use of command concept a lot to basically manage separation of concerns. So more to it in a next session.